Hello, hello. Welcome to Philosophy of Health. This is your disabled host. So I went to Boston University and I was really, really lucky because I had a really cracked out guidance counselor in high school, and I transferred my senior year to a high school that had counselors who knew how to get people like me into BU. And it was funny because in high school, we would have all of these reps come. Instead of a college fair, it was like just individual colleges would come and you could sign up if you were interested in that school. And some person from NYU would come and you could sign up and meet with the people from NYU, and they could give you their sales pitch and they could size you up as well and kind of let you know if you're not really NYU material. Columbia would come, and that's what this world was at the time. I don't know how they do this shit now. But that was kind of the deal for any of us who were graduating like top 10 or 20%. So I went to BU because I knew I wanted to go to New England because I read the book The Secret History. And that book, up until very recently, has been my mythology. And it ended when I met Donna Tartt. I'm writing a thing about that, and hopefully I will actually finish it, and because it's a really cool story. But I'm here because of that book. And I didn't apply to the college that it was based on because I wanted to go to school in a city, and I liked Boston, and I liked the idea of New York. And NYU didn't give me any money, and BU gave me a ton of money. But despite the fact that it gave me over $100,000, I was still very in debt because colleges like that are more than $100,000. So I was very lucky that I got to go. I did take out student loans to go there. And because I was poor and because I knew what it was that I was getting, I milked that bitch. I was always just amazed at how sort of lackadaisical my classmates were. There were very, very few professors. I can only think of one professor who I never went to their office hours, and I can't really think of a professor that I really liked who I didn't at least visit in their office hours. Most I had lunch with, had tea with, because they're on my payroll, man. I'm their student. They're sort of obligated to talk to me, even, I'm their client, was how I saw it. And they were always really nice. They were always really psyched. Later on in life, when my friends started to become professors and stuff and TAs, I realized that no one ever goes to office hours. So I think they were just sort of pleased to have the company and to be liked and for someone to appreciate the subject matter enough to want to talk about it. And I knew I was out of my league. I knew I was the only kid in my group who went to public schools. And that was the first private school I had ever been to, and those were the first private kids I had ever been surrounded by. And so I hadn't been to other countries. I hadn't learned any other languages. I didn't know really basic things. I didn't know what the biological process of a period was. I had to have a roommate draw menstruation and explain to me why it was and what tissue was actually converting into blood. I didn't understand the theory of evolution. It wasn't allowed to be taught in my high school, nor was sex education. Hence, I didn't understand the female body. And there was just so much that I didn't know, and it was not for a lack of being willing to know. It was actually the opposite. I was just starving for knowledge because I knew that the small thing that I was in Arkansas wasn't it. I knew they were wrong, but I didn't have enough information or enough guidance to really be able to say and have some sort of scientific, logical argument as to why they were wrong, nor did I have any alternatives to really explore what was right. That's why I don't like those scientific arguments that say well, do you have a better suggestion? And it's like, well, maybe not, but it doesn't mean that your suggestion is great. Those are two separate things. And I also don't really like the idea of if you don't have reasoned absolute proof, then your arguments don't matter. They're akin to guesswork, or they're related to George Bush's statements about going with his gut. I go with my gut, not my brain. Well, sometimes you do have to go with your gut. It's not a good idea to go with his gut, but other people's guts, just like other people's brains, are much, much better than George Bush's. So I always had a sense that things weren't right, and I've trusted that sense. And when I haven't trusted that sense, things have gone pretty badly for me. But in any case, I had a really awesome and a really awful experience at BU. It was very lonely to be really poor amongst the wealthy, but at the same time, it was fucking awesome to have access to at least some of the things that these people have. And one of those things were my professors, and I really connected with these guys, and they really helped me greatly, and we'll meet more and more of them. And because I think the world should know them, but also I don't think they should be celebrities because I see what we do to celebrities. But what they have to offer to the world, I really actually want to get that out into the world. Now, this guy, Professor Lucas, is from the Czech Republic. He's a Czechoslovakian dude. When you go to college, if you go to a big college like Harvard, NYU, or whatever, a lot of the professors are not American. English is not their first language. I know that I had an especially difficult time in my math classes and my science classes because it was all these Asian people and Russian people who spoke their own unique version of English. And one of the reasons that I'm also really glad that I went to BU is that at least in the year that I was accepted, it was the absolute top international school. It had the largest percentage and just pure quantity number of bodies of people from different countries. A lot of colleges boast that they have students from every country, but we had the most of the students from every country. So it was really cool. It was a microcosm, and it was a way to experience the world. And it was weird because I went from being in a small town in Arkansas with 30,000 people to a metropolitan major university with a population of 30,000 people. So it was a big adjustment. It was really tough, and it was really stressful because I'm competing with people who have forgotten more foreign languages than I will ever learn. But it was also awesome because when I watch the news and I see some shit going down in Pakistan, I have a real life reference point. I have a story about a Pakistani dude who was the kind of Pakistani dude who would go to BU. Even though that's one person, only one, I can't think of anyone who runs so contrary to the stereotype of Pakistani people that we see in the news. So it was cool to go to a party and see a bunch of Germans, French people, and Bulgarians, and watching them not sleep because the World Cup was on, and seeing people from Asia be Asian, and meeting Africans who get to come here, and meeting who I think might be the only Middle Eastern figure skater. It was really interesting. It was a great way to see the world when I wasn't able to afford to travel it. It came to me. So it was great to have that in my classmates, and it was also great to have that in my professors, even when it was hard to understand what the fuck they were saying. luckily for us, Professor Lucas has a wonderful accent. He's really just delightful to listen to. Professor Lucas presents like a Czech version of Christopher Walken. Like, if this dude had a biopic, Christopher Walken would totally play him. He's the only person I've ever met who has ever used the words Scylla and Charybdis in conversation. In fact, until he said it in conversation, I never actually knew how that was pronounced, and it wasn't until after I listened to it again that I realized what the fuck he was talking about. So in the interview, I have no idea what he's talking about. But Scylla and Charybdis is the ancient Greek mythology version of a rock and a hard place. It was like this part of the sea where on one side you have a six-headed sea monster who will fucking eat your shit, but you don't want to go too far away from him because on the other side there's a giant whirlpool abyss thing. So you can either be swallowed by a sea monster or by the sea itself, and so that's their rock and a hard place. We kind of dumbed it down a little bit. So he is super smart, obviously, and and it's funny to be interviewing these really, really smart people. It's not easy to keep up with them, and I often think that it's almost a shame that I have to be in these interviews and I can't just have them talk to you guys. But he's so great, and he's one of the few historians that I've encountered who really sees historical figures as human beings. Like, he presented these giant names to us: Maria Theresa, Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI, with such completely identifiable problems. And that's the thing, is that even though we're modern and we're completely programmed differently, we're still the same stuff. We're still these bodies. And so it's very interesting to go back, and when a leader is having some sort of medical problem, you're like, oh, my aunt had that. And it connects us because they were human and they had bodies. And I love the way he sort of brought that to me. His specialty is the history of Central Europe, but that's a bit of a misnomer, because when you do the whole history of Central Europe, for so much of Central Europe's history, it was a Middle Eastern and Arabic history. The whole history of Central Europe is an occupation between the Ottoman and the Holy Roman Empires. And so the fight, between Christianity and Islam, that is a long story. There is no short version of that relationship. And we really didn't get into history that goes that far back. But I really do hope that we will meet again and explore more themes, especially as I learn more about history, because I was a philosophy person and I'm trying to catch up on some of my history here. So today, he takes us through some really, really awesome connections. And it's funny because I really love studying like the 20th century. I'm really interested in the modern age, the birth of psychology. Like, Freud published his first book, The Interpretation of Dreams, in 1901. So I really like turn of the century stuff. And so I see decades. I see like the 20s, I see the 40s, I see the 60s. And it's like how astronomers and geologists, like, they see millennia. And then historians, who are only dealing with history, they're seeing centuries. In any case, we cover a lot. And as I was listening to it, I was thinking about the fact that his daughters, they understand his native Czech, but they don't speak it. He's never heard them speak it. He doesn't really know if they know they certainly don't know the grammar and stuff like that. And that's true for a lot of my immigrant friends. They can understand what their parents are saying, but they respond in English. So you're sitting there on the couch and following half of an argument. But I feel like that's a really great metaphor for where we are. we have really lost contact with our roots. But I do think that when we hear wisdom, it is a visceral experience for us, and it rings true, and we know what it means, but we can't ourselves produce it. We don't know the structure. We don't know the grammar. We just know enough to repeat, but we couldn't actually explain to someone else why we know that's true. I think a lot of us are sort of there when it comes to contact with our primitive and possibly just higher selves. And I have to say that there's something really fascinating to me about the Czechs. You know, Kafka is probably the most famous Czech. Kafka, and we'll have a Kafka scholar on soon, I hope. But Kafka, you know, there's just something so haunting about him. And it wasn't until I discovered a guy named Alfred Cuban and saw the film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari that I started to see a sort of pattern of the Czech spirit, or at least the Praguian spirit, since they were all Praguers. And the shit is wild, man. There's something crazy that I find really alluring about the culture. And actually, I didn't really think about it, but the first philosopher that I'm interviewing, also who I had at BU, his background goes back to the Czechs. But in any case, I will turn you over to Professor Lucas. But I wanted to mention there was a story that I kept trying to get him to tell, but then we kept getting distracted onto other things. But the story that he told us in class, so he told us two stories where he just marveled at female leaders and how they could do things that male leaders couldn't. And one of them was there was a woman who grew up to be like a duchess of the Habsburg Empire. I forget, maybe it was Maria Theresa. And she, you know, the women, they rode side saddle. And I just remember him marveling at how she rode faster than everyone else, and she did it riding side saddle. Which is interesting. It's like she wasn't disabled, but they disabled her. And even so, she whooped their asses. And it was like a glimmer in his eye, as if it was his own daughter or his own wife or mother. Just, wow, look at her fucking go. And then the other story that he told was Maria Theresa. I mean, she had like a shitload of kids. And she had some trouble when she first came to power because men didn't want to deal with her. She's a woman. And she went to some dude's court, I forget who it was, and he said, yeah, I was willing to see a woman, but not a pregnant one, because she was, like, about to fucking burst open. And he was like, oh no, absolutely not. And she was just like, okay, so you'll talk to a woman who's not pregnant? And he was just like, yeah, I'm not talking to a woman that's about to give birth. And she was like, okay. So she just didn't leave, and she just like sat there for a couple days until she went into labor, and like all up in the middle of this king's court, she straight up gave birth. And then after she delivered this baby, she just went, all right, now let's do some fucking business. And that's just an example of a display of strength that female leaders can exercise. And she knew how to wield that politically. And you'll see how brilliant she is and what a female leader who doesn't want to hide that she's female or try to act more aggressive, what it really looks like, what true female feminine strength looks like. It's amazing. And with that, I bring you Professor Igor Lucas.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we're doing very well.
Very good, yes.
Okay, so thank you for joining me today. I'm very excited to meet with you.
It's my pleasure to see you again.
Thank you. So I took a history course with you here at BU called Central Europe. And I can't remember exactly why I took it. I didn't take any other history classes while I was here, but there was something about the description of the course that led me to you. And I was so pleased because I felt like you gave me new eyes, and the perspective from which you chose to tell us these stories that many of us already knew, like with Marie Antoinette. You made it human. You were always able to make things very human for us and bring them down to our level. And you also have an interesting connection with history yourself. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your family and the stock that you come from.
Well, I'm not entirely sure that I do have any interesting history in my family. Certainly not one that would compare with Marie Antoinette.
Right.
But thank you very much for your very kind words. One would have to somehow fail to be human, not to be flattered and not to be very grateful. And I'm most grateful for your very kind words. I don't need to tell you that this is what one could legitimately call job satisfaction.
Wonderful. Yes.
But I think I come from a perfectly normal Central European family, normal in the sense that it's complicated. And it's complicated in the sense that although we were all Czechs on all sides, I think my grandparents were very comfortable speaking German. My grandmother met my grandfather in Vienna. My other grandparents lived in Silesia, and it used to have a very significant German majority. And my grandparents, as Czechs, were in a minority there. Another, I think, aspect of the family is that my father's parents were conservative and wealthy.
Those two things never go together.
Well, it's more complicated on my mother's side because those grandparents were very humble. My grandmother worked in Vienna, I think from the age of 15 or 16, as a nanny in a wealthy family of a lawyer. And my grandfather was a regular soldier serving the Emperor Franz Josef.
The Habsburg Empire.
The Habsburg Empire, exactly. And again, they were completely Czech ethnically, but I think they were more at home in German because they grew up in this German-speaking milieu. To cut the long story short, the two families, I think, then ended up being or the two sides of the family eventually ended up being on the same economic level, because those humble grandparents had a son who became a very successful and wealthy and well-known filmmaker.
Oh.
And a rich guy.
Oh, yeah. And that was your grandfather?
No, that was my uncle, actually. That was the son of my grandparents.
Oh.
My mother's
Who's
older...
your uncle?
Well, his name was Brom, B-R-O-M. Anyway, he was a fixture of pre-World War II movies. He made several successful movies. I think they're actually deposited in Smithsonian.
Wow.
So they started at the bottom and rose up. Although I think when it came to class, those halves were never really comparable. So the poor became rich, but they maintained the characteristics of having once been poor.
That's what happens. So you were able to compare two people of the same economic class who started off in different places.
Yes, and I loved them both and learned from both. And it was great fun, really, sort of going back and forth. And to my eyes, I don't know how this was perceived by parents who I'm sure had to negotiate more complicated situation. But to my child's eyes, there were no, landmines, so there were never any issues about class or money and so on. But one could see the advantages of both, the sort of effortlessness of the upper middle class, who were sort of, to repeat myself, who were effortlessly brilliant.
Right.
There is this kind of pretense of absolute sort of effortlessness. We don't need to sweat to be great. And then there were the strivers, who killed themselves to climb up, who had to sort of work hard and make connections and who had to fight for success.
And appreciated, I'm sure, every step of the way.
And I'm sure they appreciated it and were pretty proud of it too, because they gained it by their own brow. They really had to try.
And do you have your own kids?
Yes, I have 2 daughters. You see their portraits, I think, all over the place.
Lovely, yeah.
Yes, I have 2 daughters. One is soon to be 25, and the other one is 19.
And do you keep them connected to your family?
Oh, yes, we go there every summer, actually.
Do they speak?
Well, that's a kind of sore issue. My wife is American, so Czech was never spoken at home. And I never had the ability to speak one language with my children and another language when my wife was around. So it ended up being a kind of mixed bag, as the Americans say. It's a strange phrase, if you ask me. Mixed bag of what,
exactly.
Right? But in any case, that's what Americans say, and we'll accept it. And what I mean by this is that I think my daughters understand pretty much everything, but I have never heard them actively speak.
Okay, right. I think a lot of my friends who have immigrant parents are, I think, in that same boat. So one of the things that I'm interested in is the idea of lineage and the idea of genealogy, especially as it applies to successorship. I remember one of the big sort of philosophical points you made in your class was that that's the issue of every empire or of every political organization. It seems like you end up with a great man, or a great woman, but a great founder. One of the great quotes from your course that's in my notes is that you said, great men almost always spawn idiot sons.
Oh, God, I really said that. I'm sure it's obviously an overstatement. It cannot be true.
Sure, I'm sure it was a bit of, rhetorical.
Across the board and so on. But I think, yes.
By and large, yeah.
One can look at Stalin, who was very upset about the quality of his children. One can look at Churchill, who said the nastiest things about all his children, really. So I think it sort of, whether one is a dictator or whether one is a sort of icon of democracy, such as Churchill, I think it's pretty difficult for a child to grow up next to a very successful parent.
Yeah.
If I were more in tune with American popular culture, I would probably be able to give you countless examples from Hollywood where the stars have, children who struggle desperately to stay away from drugs and destructive behavior and so on. And you think that these people have been somehow handicapped from the beginning by the fame of their parents.
I remember that you told us about the weird way that they chose successors in the Ottoman Empire, the way they chose sultans.
Right. Well, I think that every totalitarian system or every even closed political system that is pretty much anything except for democracy is bound to discover sooner or later that succession is really the weakest point of the whole system. It's the weakest spot. Because if a totalitarian leader makes it clear who his successor is, then the successor already, by being named and identified, has already stolen a good chunk of the power that the totalitarian person wants to maintain. For instance, Hitler, once the war started, had to come to terms with the fact that one can be mortal, even someone like Hitler, and so he named Goering to be his successor. And as the war was coming to an end, Goering was desperate to, he had his own mental issues. He was
he sure did.
He was addicted to various kinds of pills and so on. I don't think he was a rational person at that point. But nevertheless, he remained completely loyal to Hitler, yet Hitler concluded that Goering was somehow plotting behind his back, which he really wasn't, and he sentenced him to death, and he, in fact, had him arrested, and undoubtedly Goering would have been shot had it not been for a last-minute rescue by some Luftwaffe.
Nice to have Luftwaffe connections.
Yeah, well, somebody came to his rescue.
Yeah.
So even in that system, there was a very serious issue. The Soviet Union never solved the succession situation. When Lenin died in 1924, it took about 3 years for Stalin to become completely unchallengeable dictator. It took him until about 1927, maybe a bit earlier, but still there was some opposition prior to 1927. And then, of course, there came the horrific purges with hundreds of thousands of victims and so on. And all of this was an attempt by Stalin to maintain his absolute supremacy that would be unchallengeable. And weeks before he died in 1953, he threatened all the people around him with another round of executions. And there is very credible reason for believing that he may have been either killed by his colleagues or that his colleagues had come to him after he suffered a debilitating stroke and simply chose to do nothing and waited for him to die because they knew that were he to recover, he would most likely launch yet another round of purges and executions and so on among the top echelons of the party. So now to come to your point about the Ottoman Empire, this is absolutely true that the sultans, in fact, had a...
it was psychotic.
Well, it was really part of the same thinking that was then displayed by Stalin, by Hitler, and I imagine other totalitarian rulers, that once one became a sultan, one had to worry about one's brothers. And once you worried about your brothers, you had to worry about your brothers' wives and your brothers and wives and their wives' children.
Children, that's right.
And so once you became a sultan, the tradition was that all your brothers would be executed. And at some point, all your brothers' wives and concubines and their children. And it became a horrific, incredibly nasty, bloody thing that the Ottoman Empire was supposed to simultaneously celebrate the rising of a sultan, but at the same time it was expected to sort of passively witness the bloodbath in the imperial family. It was incredible. And therefore the sultans, at some point in history, created a tower which was really the sort of humane alternative, where upon becoming a sultan, the new sultan imprisoned his brothers in the tower, and the tower had only, it was a permanent prison. Once you entered, you could not leave.
Wow.
And it had only one window from which you could see the sea and nothing else. And there was a deaf mute who brought you your food every day, but otherwise you were completely isolated from the outside world. And in some cases, the prisoner lived in the tower for years and years and years. And then all of a sudden, a delegation showed up, and they were bowing, and they started calling him their sultan because the previous one had died. And so he was now in line of succession, and they were bowing to him. And this person who had spent his adult life in total isolation was supposed to somehow lead the Ottoman Empire to modernity. We all know what happened to the Ottoman Empire. It's no longer on the map. It disintegrated, and Turkey to this day is struggling with finding its own feet and a new identity. And I believe that the Soviet Union really after the Stalinist period, very much like the Ottomans had done before them, found it impossible to design some sort of succession system. So that after Stalin died, then came briefly Malenkov, then came Khrushchev, and there were horrific, executions again from Stalin to Khrushchev. And then Khrushchev was only overthrown. It's like, being sent to the tower of sorts.
Right.
They didn't kill him, but they totally isolated him.
Almost worse than death.
And then to the very end, no succession within the Soviet Union was without conspiracies, there would be no longer bloodbaths, but there were always, including the succession of Gorbachev, there would be some behind-the-scenes maneuverings and conspiracies and rumors and so on, and purges. And so, yes, I think that neither the Ottoman Empire nor the Soviet Union had ever solved the question of succession.
Has anyone?
Well, I think democracies have really found a way of doing it. So every American middle schooler knows that if the president somehow is unable to execute the duties of the office, there is the vice president, and there is the speaker,
right,
and so on. And I am told it goes down to something like 24, 25 positions, including the most junior member of the president's cabinet.
Have you seen Battlestar Galactica?
I have not. No.
It's a very good show, but it's sort of it's in the future, but there's a huge interplanetary explosion at one point. And everyone dies, and this person who was so far down that line that no one ever suspected would ever be president is the next one in line because the 20 other people in front of her died. And that's kind of how the show starts.
Well, as an aside to this, maybe the English royal family has found a solution to this. I think they have a regulation that the Queen must never fly on the same airplane as her immediate successor. In this case, the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles.
Was that in...
They're not supposed to be on the same airplane, or
right.
So I'm told. I don't know if that's true.
Wasn't there something recent that happened in the Czech Republic where a bunch of high-level people died in a plane crash together?
I think that was in Poland.
Poland, you're right. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
98 of them died. But I think they, too, followed some sort of, security regulation, so... it wasn't the whole government. 98 people died. That's a very significant chunk, although that includes bodyguards and assistants.
Sure.
But
those low-level people.
Yes, exactly. I said exactly facetiously.
Right. Yes, of course.
But in the sense of government, the president perished, but the prime minister did not, and so on.
You always said that Maria Theresa was your favorite leader or your favorite character in history, and I always wanted to ask you why that was. You did tell us some interesting stories, and you also gave me, again, a more human look at the French Revolution and the whole deal with Louis and Marie Antoinette, and I was hoping you could tell us more about that.
I think Maria Theresa was truly an admirable person. She
I mean, for me as an American, God forbid we have a female leader. And so it was fascinating to see what that difference, what it means and what it can mean.
Well, yes, I actually often reflect on this, that in some cultures, and sometimes in the cultures where one would expect it the least, you see just examples of much greater tolerance toward female leaders.
You can't drive a car, but you can rule the country. That's fine.
Then in the 21st century America, where, we simply cannot stop talking about women's rights and so on. And yet, it seems to me that the American public, even today, would have a hard time electing a female president.
We can't stop talking about what they're wearing.
Yes, right, exactly. And I think another thing is that we saw, obviously, with the two elections of President Obama, that the country was or demonstrated its ability to elect an African American president, but not a woman.
Well, in the history of civil rights in the U.S., black males have always been higher up than white females politically, it seems.
Well, I don't know if that's true. I never thought of it, but I'm sure there is something to it. Yes, we will soon find out in the next presidential round, right?
Right. Well, and then there's also the issue of, when they talk about how female politicians have to act like men.
Yes.
In a sense. So they have to be even tougher on foreign policy.
Yes, and some of them are.
Yes, they are.
One would hope for a sort of less bellicose attitude toward foreign policy issues from a woman. And yet one has witnessed just in one's lifetime that women, in fact, were often more eager to use force. Madeleine Albright comes to mind, who, in fact, aggressively questioned General Powell. And when he displayed during some meeting in the National Security Council or maybe in the White House of President Clinton, when General Powell warned against use of force in the Balkans, Madeleine Albright said, well, General, why do we have these armed forces? You constantly tell us they're so great, and yet you're never willing to use them. What is it really good for? And then she went and bombed Serbia, and I think her role has never been really properly questioned, specifically with the reference to the bombing of Serbia in 1999, but I bet it will come later. And I think that this is one way of illustrating the point you've made, that sometimes women feel that in order to be accepted as legitimate players among the heavy hitters, they too have to be heavy hitters. I, in fact, heard Madeleine Albright telling a gathering of women who were interested in politics, you've got to interrupt, you've got to be aggressive, you've got to be this and that.
Play like a man. Yeah.
Well, she didn't quite put it that way, but that is, of course, the implication,
Right, yeah.
And then, just as you say, women have to sort of move between the Scylla and the Charybdis. They have to sort of navigate this treacherous terrain between being seen as, weak women on the one hand, or being guys who are sort of warriors, rather than being women. And I think one can only look at Germany that has had a female leader for years now, and she is among the, I think, more talented people in politics since the end of the Cold War.
She's kept Europe together.
She's kept Europe together. She's kept Germany together, which in itself is not a small thing given the divide between East and West. And I think she has also proven to be very reasonable when it comes to, let's say, Eastern Europe, but very tough when it comes to Russia, which, compare her to the French with their collection of male prime ministers and male presidents. I think the German chancellor has done very well indeed.
One of the things that I've noticed is that it seems like we've been really hindered in terms of health and in terms of general progress because of Cold War stuff, and also it seems like since the First World War, really, we've never recovered from that. It was sort of an initial tremor. And then World War II was a huge earthquake. But it seems like it all came together in World War I, and we've just never worked out the idea of globalization.
Well, you don't know how much I embrace this position that you have expressed. People, I think, overlook the importance of World War I. Yeah. I think World War I set all the horrors that followed into motion. It was the original impetus. Yes, it was less destructive than World War II, but it really set the tone for the whole century. And I think that the most destructive aspect of World War I was that one saw that millions of human lives could be sacrificed for a few yards of territory that could be just as easily abandoned next week. In order to move the front by 500 yards forward or left or right, armies were willing to send divisions into completely senseless frontal assaults against machine guns and artillery, where these men running...
And chemical weapons.
And ultimately also gas, exactly. So once it became clear that it's legitimate to kill or to sacrifice hundreds of thousands, millions of lives for nothing, because one never really knew what the cause was.
Yeah.
What is it that they were actually fighting about? Germany's place in the sun, or British Empire? I mean, it just made no sense whatsoever, right? So once it became clear that one can sacrifice human lives for some completely vague principle, then came the Bolshevik and the Nazi ideologies that would destroy the rest of the century, and they too posited some sort of chimera, and in the future they claimed that somewhere ahead of us, it is an illusion, right? So both the Nazis and the communists believed that there was some point in the future that is so great that for the sake of attaining it, one can sacrifice millions of lives. And that, I think, was the lesson learned in World War I. And so I think Lenin and Hitler both emerged from the culture of World War I, and they practiced it to the hilt. And of course, Stalin and so on was very much part of that intellectual outlook.
Right. Well, it seems also like, I think of things being ill, I think of a lot of things in terms of the body, and I think of things in terms of like the U.S. as a body or Europe as a body. And so in the U.S., because I lived in the South for a while, too long, and, you still see the devastation there of having completely demolished part of the body politic and not amputating, keeping the sick body organ as part of your overall system. And that's precisely, I think, what happened to Germany after the First World War. They really just all of Europe kind of got together and decided to just kind of shit all over Germany. And it seems like it's that, because I'm very interested in the Weimar Republic. And then it just seems like that's what created Hitler. You look at Hitler's baby picture, and he was just a cute little baby. No devil horns, nothing striking about him. And, it's like he was created from this mess of an aftermath of World War I.
Well, indeed, it was a horrifically mismanaged part of human history, to put it very mildly, from 1918 to 1939.
It just seems like the lesson we haven't learned is that when you win a war, you have to lift up that society.
Well, yes. If
they're going to stay a part of your system.
Yes, yes. But first of all, wars used to be fought for political objectives. You used force after you discovered that the diplomats could no longer move forward.
Yes.
So that's when the cannons replaced diplomacy. But once you achieved your objective, then the cannons were silenced and diplomats came back and essentially said to the defeated side, and the defeat often took a week or a few weeks in a 19th century style of campaign, and said, well, we told you so, and here are the terms, please sign on the dotted line. And the terms were very often most generous toward the defeated side.
Really?
Yes.
Can you give some examples of?
Well, yes. The best example is the a war between Prussia and Austria in 1866, the Battle of Königgrätz and Sadowa. It essentially was one sharp engagement. Yes, tens of thousands of people died in the course of a few days, particularly one day in the summer of 1866. But once the Austrian ranks were broken by the victorious Prussians, it was over. And the King of Prussia, heavily advised by his Chancellor Bismarck, immediately extended their hand to the defeated side, called them the most flattering terms, and said, "Dear cousins, let's just sit down." And there was no loss of territory, there was no compensation, no crushing conditions imposed. It was essentially, we've made our point, we achieved our political objective, now Prussia can unite the rest of Germany.
Right, because 5 years later, that's when Germany became Germany.
Which is exactly what happened exactly in January 1871. And that's all the Prussians needed. And the same, I think, was with France, where the conditions were a little harsher. The Franco-Prussian War followed the one we've just discussed in 1870, 1871. But again, it wasn't crushing. It wasn't massacres or large-scale executions. It was a swift military victory, and diplomats came back, cannons were silenced, deal was signed, and so on. Then comes the 20th century, and all of a sudden, everything changes, right?